Blending Ash by Oliander.
Adrenaline drove me forward, and I flew between the collapsing columns, racing to an imagined safety. My feet pounded the ground, and I dodged every few seconds to avoid running into someone or the large debris that flew around me. The people who stopped to turn and look at the awesome eruption behind me instantly transformed from curiosity to horror. Every few seconds, I would see someone crushed by one of the massive boulders that were thrown towards us. It didn't help that the buildings we ran through were all marble structures with heavy architecture. The weakest sections had already collapsed, but I could tell the column structure that held the pathway roof would soon give way. I heard the rumbling of the volcano, and I hoped that if I just kept my focus on the empty grass field before me, I would be spared from the raining fragments of Earth. Every minute in this pandemonium was an eternity of terror and panic. I saw children huddled near the corner of a building, and I hoped that they would find safety. I halted, and what little focus I had was crushed underneath a stone column right in front of my feet. I could feel my body shake from the continuous earthquake. I ran around the new pile of rubble and took off again. I felt a sharp pain in my thigh that traveled down my leg. I paused to wince and held the bruised area. I must have been hit by something. My delay sealed my fate, and as I glanced back, I saw another piece of the mountain that had been blown off, coming straight for me. I crouched next to the tall metal statue just a foot away from where I was and felt the ground shift underneath me. There in the dirt and rubble, I was forced to my stomach. Death by crushing did not seem optimal, but I didn't have a lot of options. Finally, the pressure gave way and the shaking lessened. I opened my eyes and coughed from the dust in the air, surprised that I was still alive. Above me, a crack of light appeared. I crawled towards it and discovered that the statue had fallen just as the boulder hit, and the earthquake depressed the ground where I had stood. It was a narrow escape, and thanks to my small cage, I was protected from other flying debris. Somehow I had survived. But how long would that last? I peered out my sliver of a window between the statue and earth, and watched people scurrying about, trying to run and hide from collapsing structures as volcanic debris pelted the hillside city. I craned my neck to see the valley below. It seemed to have more fragments than structures now. Moving some of the rubble, I was able to see our attacker, the now smoking volcano. In the distance, red spurts of lava were spewing from its mouth. The color seemed to branch upward, in the pattern of a tree, into a dark layer of clouds that loomed out across my hillside town. I watched as the clouds rolled forward and grew larger, snuffing out every ounce of light in the sky. I wanted to try to get out from underneath my prison, but this was probably the safest place. I continued to watch as the light in front of me faded. In the gray and brown haze of dust, I still saw spurts of red and yellow in the distance. But soon they too disappeared, a large cloud of black ash spilling over the valley below. When night had fallen, I could hear people crying in pain or yelling to find someone, but it was simply too dark to see, and no one came near to where I was buried. I called out a few times, but was ignored. From where I lay huddled, it seemed as if the world had halted. I waited for hours. Sleep soon came, but was interrupted by noises, and even more rushing winds and crashing objects. I was awoken a few more times to feel the earth trembling. At one point I heard massive thunder rolling across the valley and up the mountain to where I was sheltered. It was followed by rain. The echoes seemed to travel farther than I thought possible. Each time I could hear people crying out in fear. After hours of waiting and drifting between sleep and fear, I could feel that it was morning. Despite the hazy sky outside, light was reaching my greedy eyes. The violence and noise from the night before had calmed, and there was a hint of peace in the air. I could finally see how large the area was that both trapped and protected me. The dirt cave was about 3 by 8 feet long, and was roughly oval-shaped. I quickly found a stone and began to dig my way out. Slowly, my opening grew. Once I could fit through, I crawled out and stood to shake off the dust. The blue in the sky was growing lighter now, and the sky was much clearer than I anticipated due to the rain from the night before. I gazed at the destruction that littered the mountainside of the valley. I felt completely alone. There didn't seem to be anyone left. I assumed that most people had vacated the city or had been killed during the eruption. A desolate feeling knotted in my stomach, and I began walking through the rubble, not sure what to do. I wondered if there was anyone I could assist. I routinely called out, hoping to hear a voice or a cry. Nothing. I continued down the mountainside alone. My leg was not as painful as I thought it would be at first. I had a massive bruise, but the rest of my body just felt tired from the lack of sleep. I approached the large campus library that had been the center of my university. It was partially collapsed. It appeared dangerous, but my curiosity forced me in through the main doors. All around, books were strewn about and tables turned over. I called out to see if anyone was in there. I was actually half surprised to hear a response. It was muffled, but the sound was rewarding to me since I had felt like a lone survivor since leaving my hole. I rushed over to the corner of the great room and saw an elderly man trying to free himself. He was pinned between two bookcases. I wondered if he had been the librarian. The thought brought a smile to my face. I found a broken board and began to apply some leverage to the massive shelf. It budged, and the man began to wiggle free. It took a minute for us to coordinate his movements with what little leverage I could muster, but he got out. Looking feeble, I helped pull him over my broad shoulders and helped carry him out. He breathed roughly and patted my back. "Thank you, young man." I nodded, remembering my indecision to enter. "I'm glad I came into the building," I said. "Otherwise I may not even heard your call." I helped him to a small patch of grass that seemed unscathed by the ruin. Once he settled, I spoke up. "You rest. I'm going to go try to find us some water." He nodded in gratitude, and I left him sitting there. I searched the library and was lucky to find a vending machine that hadn't been damaged. I picked up a leg of a broken chair in the main area and smashed the glass. I pulled as many water bottles out as I could and rushed back to the resting man who had fallen asleep. I nearly laughed. At a time like this, what else should I expect? Nudging his shoulder and handing him a bottle of water, he thanked me and laid back down with his head in the shade of a toppled street sign. I spoke up before he was too far gone. "I'm going to go out and see if I can find any more survivors. Are you okay?" The man nodded, obviously still in some form of shock. And so I left him to search the city once more. Scene 2. It was dusk now, and I had successfully found a young couple and two middle-aged women. Most of them had minor injuries. One of the two women had rolled her ankle and fallen into a shattered window. The glass shards weren't very deep, but it looked extremely painful and had nearly taken an hour to remove them. The husband had been knocked down and had a makeshift bandage around his temples, covering the gash of just above the ear. When the group assembled, I encouraged everyone by saying the same 3 statements over and over. They can't forget us. The volcano was far too big for the entire world to miss. Or, I'd say, we'll probably find more supplies in the morning. But for now, I was tired and really didn't care to dwell on the predicament at hand. I wondered what the next day would bring, and fell asleep under a partly clouded starry sky. I was no sooner asleep when I was awakened by a loud clap of thunder. Clouds had rollen in, and rain was afoot. The air smelled moist, and I knew it was close. I helped the awakened group gather in the nearby library to avoid the storm, and everyone soon fell back to sleep, except me. The one question that kept coming to my mind was why. I was so tired, but it wouldn't come. All I could hear was the beating of the rain on the roof, and the thunder as the rolling clouds slowly passed overhead. From time to time, drafts of chilly wind found their way into the building, and I shivered with each new wave. Eventually I stood up, hoping to get my bearings, and maybe tire out my body a little more. I wandered through the library, but much of it was filled with junk from the ceiling, metal bars from construction, and scattered books. I laughed inside as I thought of all the times I would have loved to spend the night in the library. I had been studying philosophy and politics since I had started at the university. and most of my research papers led me back here. Tonight, though, was different. What I would give to be in bed with a roof over my head. I wandered out to the porch and sat down to watch the sheets of rain descend upon the destruction that lay before me. I could see out across the field that connected the different centers of learning. This had once been the most prestigious location for education in the world, and to see much of it in ruin crushed my hopes for the future. I wondered how many of my classmates had escaped. Then I thought, who would miss me if I hadn't survived? The realization that unlike all my classmates, I'd never had any close friends or dated much. I'd been so focused on my studies that the rest of the world had become a blurry distraction to be avoided. The rain stopped eventually, and I leaned up against one of the structure's 2 front pillars connecting the stairs and the entrance. I stared up into the cloudy sky. I nearly let myself drift to sleep, but jolted back to consciousness when the clouds cleared momentarily. The pockets of sky I could see were nothing like I had remembered. I could see some stars, but the constellations were all wrong. What's more, I could see hundreds of stars falling from the sky. A brief panic overcame me before I calmed down. I took in this amazing sight. I couldn't quite pin down what was happening, but it was unlike anything I'd ever seen. First, a sleeping volcano awoke to demolish its valley and the neighboring mountainside. Then an earthquake, now the sky. I pondered and stared at the stars for nearly an hour before I was completely overwhelmed with exhaustion. Scene 3. I was awoken by a member of our group. The 2 women had come out once the sun had risen and apparently been enjoying the clear weather by stretching on the lawn when they noticed me. I quickly stood up and pulled myself together. I looked around into the sky, half expecting to see comets hurling towards us. Nothing. I spoke up. I saw something very strange last night. The 2 women, Jackie and Sarah, tilted their heads in interest. I saw hundreds of stars falling, and it was incredible. And the constellations were... I paused and realized what I must have sounded like. A change in the constellations? Impossible. It must have been that I was just so tired. I smiled and shook my head. Anyway, it was an amazing scene. Sarah chuckled softly. I'd like to see that. Maybe we're in a meteor shower right now. Don't they usually dissipate over a few days? Jackie nodded in agreement and turned to her. Let's wait up tonight. Maybe the sky will be clear enough so that we can get a look at it. Deal. Sarah smiled and looked at me. You gonna join us? I shrugged and agreed to the plan, wondering if it would look just as odd as the night before, or if I would be surprised yet again. The couple soon joined us, and the group began chatting, trying to make everyone feel a little more at ease in our new reality. I felt slightly awkward because it seemed like everyone was waiting on me to tell them what to do for the day. In truth, I didn't know where our next meal would come from, or where we would stay, but spoke up once the older gentleman finally joined us. So now that we're all hungry, why don't we capitalize on the motivation and split up to find supplies, shelter, and maybe even rescue? Everyone readily agreed, and I paired up with Mr. Guild. The couple began traveling down the mountainside, and Sarah and Jackie went east towards the rising sun, and I took Mr. Guild up the graded mountain up to the buildings I had come from. I figured we could head back down and around to cover the west side of the mountain as well later in the day. I knew it wasn't the easiest route since most of the initial walk was an incline. Mr. Guild seemed to be worn out by the second switchback, and I turned to him. Tell you what, Mr. Guild, I have a proposal for you. I looked at him with concern, but trying not to insult the man. I know this isn't the easiest, and at the next set of buildings, let's find somewhere safe for you to explore while I head up further. Mr. Guild nodded in gratitude. It was clear that he was tired. We soon found a courtyard area that seemed mostly secure and free of larger debris. We parted ways, and I headed up the mountain once more, with my energy renewed. I climbed at least 20 levels of the mountain city, half a mile up the mountain until I reached the residential area of the peak of the university. It was here that I traveled along some of the back roads, hoping to find at least one of the dwellings that didn't seem broken down. Almost every roof had fallen or walls split. I knew it was pointless, but I needed to find something. After an hour or so, I finally saw a small park area with a path leading around a bend of trees. The mountain must have curved here, and this land was most likely a local resident's private land. But I was curious. I had to look. The trees beckoned to me, and I peered into them trying to examine where the path led. I suddenly saw a darting figure in the dense trees. It appeared to be a woman. "Hey, are you okay?" I called out to get her attention, but she ignored me. Quickly, I headed up the path to find her, and soon found myself standing in between two peaks of the mountain. It seemed like the path had turned into a road that took you through a narrow pass. Looking around, I couldn't find the woman. She had disappeared despite my insistent calls. Within a few more minutes of wandering, the rising tree line dropped from my view. Had I reached the other side? It couldn't be. The forest was thick, and there was no way I could have walked that far. But just as I thought it, I realized that I was standing at the entrance from the park. I was confused. I had just come from here, and hadn't turned around since entering the wooded area. Then I stopped in disbelief. I couldn't move. All of the houses leading up to this area were completely fine. Not one roof, shutter, or shingle was out of place. What was this? I had just come from this area and everything was destroyed. But here, now, my mind was reeling, because even as I recognized areas, I suddenly realized it was a mere opposite in all directions. What was once on my right was now on my left. Where was I? I soon saw a man walk out of his home just 2 doors down, who began watering some potted plants. I slowly walked towards him, hoping for an answer. "Excuse me, sir." The man stopped watering and peered at me with confusion. I spoke up. "Do you know anything about the volcano eruption on the other side of the forest?" I paused, seeing his expression change to fear. The man held up his hand as if to tell me to stop. I was bewildered. His actions seemed so strange, and why hadn't there been any damage here? And how did it look so familiar to my university town? The man then put his water pitcher down and approached. "I don't know how you got here, but you need to leave. This is no place to be discussing that forest openly." His expression was intense, and I queried, "But how is it that you are unaffected by this disaster? I was just on the other side of the forest, and the destruction is horrendous there. And yet, here the world seems untouched." The man put his finger to his lips and stared at me with a gaze of near anger. Then he pointed back to the forest path and spoke softly. "Leave now or face the consequences. You know they asked us to report any odd behavior." I was taken aback by the firmness in his voice. I turned back towards the path and hurried to the trees. When I had finally retreated beyond the man's sight, I walked to another section of the dense vegetation and peered out to watch the street. The man seemed nervous and continued to look back at the path. He also kept turning his head to the other end of his road, almost expecting someone to approach. I was so focused on the man that I didn't hear anyone approach until a hand tapped me on the shoulder. I nearly hit the intruder with my arms as I spun to face them. It was the woman who I had seen before. I didn't know how to react and just stood there, looking at her. She stared at me in surprise, waiting for me to react with just a slight smile. Questions filled my head, but I knew that they would leave me spinning in thought if I asked, so I pushed them down. And I asked the only question that I could. "Who are you?" The woman smiled broadly. "I'm a friend." She was beaming, but why? And what's happening here? Again, she almost chuckled. "The flux." She turned and motioned for me to follow her. I did, unsure if I should trust her, but feeling like I knew her smile from somewhere. She looked so familiar, beautiful. Who was she? The woman led me back to the path and headed back down the way I had traveled to find the peculiar area. When we exited back into the playground, where nearly every home was surrounding us was destroyed, I started to think that I had just hallucinated the experience that had started when I entered the forest. Maybe there was a leaking gas pipe that caused hallucinations, I'm not sure. Either way, I was back in reality now, and I blinked a few times. The air had a reddish hue, and I could see the sun was already setting. The woman stopped at the edge of the street, and I paused next to her. I spoke up. So my guess is that the other side of town was just a hallucination? That you must have pulled me out of the dangerous area. Thank you. I was still unsure, but this was the only logical explanation. She turned to me and I could see her smile had disappeared. She looked almost sad, almost desperate. My name is Tia. I'm not sure what's going on, but I'd like to stick with you since we're all alone here. I couldn't figure out what she meant by that. It seemed like she knew what was happening back in the forest. Did she hallucinate too? I dismissed my confusion and nodded. Well, right. We do have a group at the library. It's about a 45-minute walk down the mountain. You can stay with us. I'm not sure how much food the others found, but you, like I said, you're welcome to join. She timidly smiled. It was different than before. She seemed so bright and joyful in the forest. Why did she seem so forlorn now? And so together we started down the hilly street and made it back to the camp by sunset. After brief introductions with the group, and my apologies to Mr. Guild, we discovered the young couple, Jake and Ashley, had found a stash of fresh food at a store nearby. With an aching belly, Tia and I ate, while the others told stories of their day. No one had seen any rescuers, or other survivors. It seemed that as though the day was fairly uneventful, for everyone except myself. Tia even told a story about feeling the earthquake and running into the forest. There she had found shelter throughout the entire onslaught of the volcano. Then, of course, her ending was finding me and bringing me back. I didn't want to share anything about the homes on the other side or the man, so I stayed quiet. When everyone had eaten and we were ready to sleep, I glanced up to the sky, but it was cloudy. No stars could be seen. The moon was still very bright and shone through the first layer, giving us at least a glow in the area. When we had all made ourselves comfortable, I sat against the wall next to Tia and peered at her. I couldn't help but wonder if something was wrong with her. She soon fell asleep and her face finally seemed at peace. Watching her sleep, I drank in her beauty. I pondered on the fact that she looked so familiar, and I did this until I, too, drifted off to sleep. Scene 4. The next day, Mr. Guild and the couple wanted to stay at the library, while the others continued the search. I couldn't help but notice that Tia seemed even more despondent today than she did the day before. She didn't even have a preference. We soon headed out, and part of me wanted to go back to the forest, but I didn't want to cause any trauma to Tia, since that was where she had escaped the disaster. We walked through the leveled streets, with no one in sight. After seeing the sun at high noon with nothing to report, I decided the area wasn't worth it, and that we would have to head up the mountain again. I turned to Tia, who had sat down on a fallen tree and was slumped over looking at the ground. Tia, I said, hurrying to her side and kneeling. What's wrong? She shook her head. I can't, Eric. I just can't go on. I want to go home. Her voice sounded hopeless. I took her hand and stood her up. When you saved me back in the woods, you seemed to exude pure happiness. What's changed? She blushed briefly and then spoke. It was the flux. I blinked in confusion. I thought I'd been hallucinating then. What do you mean by the flux? Tia's eyes glazed over, and she looked out across the distant valley. The flux is pulling our worlds together, both experiencing upheavals in its various forms. I was thrilled to see the gateway open in the woods, and hoped to escape the hell I was living. You caught me at my happiest, but this... She waved her hand out across the open mountainside. This is disheartening. I had no idea what your world would look like. I was confused and anxious by what she was explaining. Was she suggesting... Was that town on the other side real too? How does the flux happen? I asked. Tia shook her head. Well, let me explain. She motioned and we began to walk up the mountain. She described her world and said the focus of their lives was that everyone knew their interests from a young age. She said it was something like a conscience, just a knowing that grew from birth. No one ever strayed or chose to do something outside of what their intuition nudged them to do. Tia smiled weakly. When I was a girl, I was always fascinated with the stars and physics, which led to my studies in theoretical physics at the university. I never questioned it. And then I discovered the flux. It was simply part of my path. It's a little-known transitionary moment in our timelines, when the dimensions clash and cause catastrophic destruction on either world. Depending on the length of attachment, the timelines could rapidly evolve, for better or worse. The window or gateway is usually open for a short time. She paused and sighed, looking up at the mountain above us. When I discovered one beginning to form in our world, I shared it with my closest friend, hoping to keep it a secret. He told others, and soon it was the biggest topic in research and news. Factions of opinion began to arise, and some hated me for my discovery. I shook my head and nodded for her to continue. During the flux, both worlds experienced radical change. Yours a physical one, mine was more abstract. Politicians began to get involved in certain high-threat areas for gateways. I had studied this event extensively and kept the gateway we passed through a secret from everyone, including the one who'd betrayed me. Despite this, others caught on to the general location. The whole university town was on lockdown. I snuck out before sunrise, the morning of the event, and hid in the forest. When I felt the flux beginning, I followed the path to your world, and had seen the uncanny similarity. Within a few minutes of my awesome discovery, I was suddenly thrown to the ground when the first earthquake hit. I stumbled my way back to the forest to take cover in an attempt to return to my world. I was worried. They were also affected by the shaking, but once I crossed the flux line, it stopped, and I discovered that the chaos brought on by the flux was different for each world. I was about to return to my home when I saw military patrols roaming the streets. I was surprised to see you coming up the street, and so I hid. When you entered my dimension, I feared for your life. And, you know the rest of the story. I still hadn't gotten a glimpse of what your world looked like, and my curiosity was piqued, so I went back with you. I opted to join your group so I could get a better look. I could return home, I guess, but there's nothing back there for me aside from my research. And now the bridge could likely be gone. In our long walk, we had reached the forest entrance. The biggest question in my mind was why I felt such a strong connection. I nodded to the forest. In my world, this is just a natural disaster. I don't think the flux has even been discovered yet. Are you willing to head back in? Maybe there's more to learn about this event. Tia drew a smile, and I could see that some happiness returned that I hadn't noticed the day prior. She reached towards my hand and took it. If the window is still open, I can gather my research. Maybe there is more to find. I followed her into the dense line of trees, wondering if she also noticed the familiarity between us. Scene 5. The dimensional bridge had been open, and despite the danger, Tia and I had secreted behind the tree line, looking over her home. When we finally got in unnoticed, she ran to a desk and pulled out stacks of documents. I was looking through some of the pictures on her desk when I noticed a familiar face. It was my own. I turned to Tia in surprise and pointed. "Who is this?" Tia looked nervous. "That's the friend I told you about. And yes, the similarities are uncanny, but you're nothing alike. It's just a..." She paused, thinking of the right word. "It's a flux." She chuckled. I sighed apprehensively and put down the photo. "Hey, Tia, have you considered that since your world has such a strong intuition, someone might suspect you? What if you're being watched?" Tia froze and looked back at me. "I guess it's possible. Did you see anyone?" "No, but that doesn't mean someone doesn't see us through their blinds." I suddenly felt fear come over me as I finished the sentence. We both looked at each other in panic. Tia pointed to a bag near the desk and suggested I pack some supplies from the kitchen. She turned and began organizing her research into another backpack. She hurried into another room and brought out some clothes and a few other things as I finished pulling what seemed to be enough for a few days. We need to leave as quickly as possible. You're right. I can't trust anyone. The flux might be causing my world to disintegrate if our initial chaos was politicized. I felt my heartbeat speed up. We took a few more minutes to gather a couple other items, and then we cautiously left the home, headed to the trees. I kept glancing at each of the windows, trying to see any movement. At one point I was sure I could see something, and whispered to Tia to be alert. She picked up her pace and we fled in a panic back to the mountain. We reached the park area and I heard a noise. It sounded like a car, but deeper and stronger. As we passed into the trees, a helicopter rose above the houses and touched down on the street. Troops were offloaded and began chasing after us. We were about halfway and suddenly I was hit by something invisible, like a wall. Tia was ahead of me and I called out to her. She didn't seem to hear and I called out louder. Tia stopped and turned back with a frightened look on her face. She started to speak something, but I couldn't hear her. What was happening? Was the gateway closing? I heard the troops closing in on me. I needed to get through. What could I do? I screamed, "Tia, help!" She began to disappear behind the gateway, and before she disappeared completely, I saw her pointing to the tree line. I ran down the wall, all the while feeling the invisible wall with my hand. It seemed hard in some areas and soft in others. Maybe it hadn't fully closed, and I could find an area that was still open. Suddenly, like a lightning bolt, I felt a pang in my leg and I fell towards the wall. As I hit the wall, I closed my eyes, expecting a bump, but the force gave way and I folded into it. I laid on my back, writhing in pain. The soldiers must have fired towards me. I couldn't tell which dimension I had landed in, but as I slowly opened my eyes, all I saw were trees. I couldn't hear the troops, and I listened for Tia. A moment later, I heard steps running towards me. I closed my eyes again, not wanting it to be a soldier. Then I heard a familiar voice. "Eric! Eric, are you okay?" In relief, I looked up at Tia. Her smile was back, and she picked up my shoulders to hug me. Instead, she kissed me with such ferocity I forgot about the wound in my leg. When she pulled back, she looked down, almost embarrassed, her cheeks turning deep red, and began to pull supplies from my bag to help clean and bandage my wound. I smiled and reached for her arm. We caught each other's eyes. Tia nodded slightly and quickly turned back to my wound. Luckily, the bullet had shot straight through my calf, so it was easy to bandage. We finally returned to the group and, for the first time, had a clear sky that night. We looked up at the stars, but this time I saw the familiar constellations. The falling stars were scarce, and I felt safe. Tia and I were nestled together on the lawn with the group, and for the first time, I felt like I belonged in my own world, and that I mattered to someone. Hey, thank you for sticking to the end of my video. If you liked the video, please consider leaving a like and a subscribe. It would mean the world to me. If you liked the story, check out Oliander. Her website is down below. And if you want to follow me on social media, check out my Instagram. There you'll have up-to-date information on upcoming videos, fun things that I'm doing, and from time to time, a nice picture of me. Like I said, please subscribe and stick around for more content.